Do you know a weapon so powerful it doesn't explode? It compounds? A weapon invisible to radar but strong enough to topple empires, rewrite alliances, and enslave nations without firing a shot. America didn't just borrow money, it mastered debt as a form of global control. From World War I to the digital dollar, each crisis became a new opportunity to expand this empire of obligation. What if U.S. dominance wasn't built on industry or innovation, but on the ability to make the world owe it everything? This is the story of how debt became America's most effective weapon and why no country can escape its grip. It didn't begin with tanks or treaties, it began with numbers on a ledger. While other empires expanded through soldiers and steel, America found something more efficient: debt. At first, it was necessity. The Civil War had drained the Union's coffers, and the Great Depression nearly collapsed the economy. But out of each crisis, Washington learned something new. Power could be printed, not just deployed. By the 20th century, debt had become more than a financial instrument. It was a mechanism of influence. The transformation was subtle. Instead of sending armies, the U.S. sent credit. Instead of annexing territory, it bound nations with interest payments. A war-torn country needed infrastructure, offer a loan, an ally hesitated to follow policy, threaten credit downgrades. This strategy didn't look like conquest, it looked like generosity. But behind every offer was a clause, and behind every clause was control. The brilliance of America's financial empire was its invisibility. No gunboats in harbors, no occupying soldiers in capitals, only spreadsheets, agreements, and unpayable obligations. And the world accepted it because the alternative wasn't independence, it was collapse. Default wasn't just financial ruin, it was geopolitical exile. You couldn't trade, import oil, pay your civil servants. And so, from Paris to Pretoria, governments made the same choice: submit, borrow, comply. The U.S. learned to weaponize this dependence with surgical precision. It could fund a war, then fund the reconstruction. It could prop up regimes or pull the plug overnight. Through institutions it helped build, the IMF, the World Bank, SWIFT, the dollar became not just a currency but a command system. A nation didn't need to lose a war to lose its sovereignty. It only had to miss a payment. This wasn't accidental. It was engineered across decades, shaped through global crises that seemed spontaneous but always ended the same way, with more power flowing to the core. America's deficits weren't signs of decline, they were tools of domination. Every dollar printed was a claim on future labor, foreign assets, or natural resources. Every bond issued was a bet that the world had no better alternative. And for over a century, it didn't. From Europe's smoking ruins in 1945 to Asia's export miracle in the 1990s, the same silent truth held. Progress ran on credit, and credit ran through Washington. But debt is a peculiar weapon. It grows stronger the more it's used, until the day it doesn't. What happens when the borrowers stop believing, when the lenders can no longer pretend repayment is possible, when the system built on obligations begins to default on itself? The world was reshaped not by armies or ideologies, but by the simple act of lending. And now, the most powerful empire in history stands not on bedrock but on IOUs. By the summer of 1914, Europe's banks were suffocating under decades of reckless lending, imperial speculation, and a rigid gold standard that made liquidity disappear when it was needed most. Behind the marble facades in London, Paris, and Berlin, bank reserves were crumbling, interbank lending had seized up, and panic was quietly spreading. Markets froze, stock exchanges closed, and depositors found themselves locked out of their own savings. This wasn't caused by war, it preceded it. The assassination in Sarajevo provided a convenient spark, but the fire had already been lit by financial kindling. The true rescue didn't come from generals or mobilizations, it came from Wall Street. J.P. Morgan Jr., heir to the most powerful banking dynasty in America, stepped in not with sympathy but with terms. His syndicate arranged massive loans to the Allied powers, starting with $500 million and soon expanding to billions. But these weren't acts of charity, they were acts of leverage. Every British artillery shell, every French rifle, every Russian train carrying troops east was financed through American banks, with the stipulation that contracts, suppliers, and profits flowed through them. This quiet shift made neutrality impossible. America had gone from observer to lender, and when you lend money to a war, you inherit its outcome. By 1917, U.S. exposure was so vast that Allied defeat would have meant mass default across the Atlantic. The Treasury itself joined the game, issuing public debt and underwriting the very governments that owed Wall Street everything. War became the guarantee that debts would be repaid, and victory became the only acceptable outcome, because the alternative was economic contagion. Morgan didn't just fund armies, he effectively managed their procurement, becoming the unofficial banker of empire. This meant he could steer what got built, who got paid, and at what markup. And as the debts compounded, so did his control. What had started as emergency liquidity became structural dominance. When the war ended, Europe emerged devastated and dependent, its treasuries hollowed out and its future mortgaged to its creditor across the sea. America, once a debtor nation, had become the world's financial axis, not because of conquest, but because of clever positioning. By turning foreign catastrophe into financial opportunity, it discovered the blueprint for a new kind of empire. The battlefield was blood-soaked, but the real conquest took place in ledgers, vaults, and loan contracts. Debt hadn't just saved Europe's banks, it had saved them in a way that made them permanently beholden to the institutions that issued it. America didn't win World War I with troops alone, it won with credit. And once the war was over, the debts didn't die. They metastasized into reparations, refinancing schemes, and decades of political instability, all orbiting around a single, undeniable truth. He who controls the loans controls the peace. When the guns fell silent in 1918, Europe was economically obliterated, but still deeply entangled in obligations no peace treaty could erase. Germany, branded the instigator of the war, was saddled with reparations so vast they eclipsed its national income. France and Britain, battered and bankrupt, insisted on collection, not out of vengeance alone, but because they needed those payments to service their own towering debts to American banks. But here's where the illusion begins. Germany didn't have the gold or industrial capacity to make these payments, so the solution came in the form of new loans from the very country receiving the payments. American banks, now global power brokers, lent money to Germany so it could pay France and Britain, who in turn funneled those funds back to New York in interest and principal. It was a financial Ouroboros, a snake devouring its own tail, designed not for resolution but for dependency. The Dawes Plan of 1924 and the Young Plan of 1929 weren't peace agreements. They were structured liquidity traps. Germany was allowed to exist economically only if it kept borrowing, and the Allies were allowed to function only if they kept collecting. The United States didn't forgive, it recycled. Dollars went out as credit and came back as repayments, interest, and ownership stakes in European industry. Sovereignty eroded not with armies but with accounting. Berlin's domestic policy became a reflection of international banker demands, while Paris and London increasingly resembled middlemen passing funds upstream. The entire post-war order rested on a delicate fiction, that debts could be paid if everyone kept pretending the math worked, but it didn't. The moment global credit tightened during the 1929 crash, the shell game collapsed. Germany defaulted, France and Britain pleaded for U.S. forgiveness, and American banks, overexposed and panicked, triggered global contagion. Yet by then, something irreversible had taken place. Debt had ceased to be a temporary emergency measure. It had become the foundation of international diplomacy. Default wasn't just an economic failure, it was treated as a moral one, a betrayal of civilization itself. Nations didn't fear invasion. They feared isolation from credit markets. The Treaty of Versailles may have ended the war, but the financial architecture that followed ensured that no country could act freely without consulting its creditors. This was the quiet triumph of American finance. It didn't require military bases or puppet governments. All it needed was a cycle of obligations so complex and entrenched that even escape would mean collapse. By the early 1930s, one truth became unshakable. America's power didn't rest on its ability to lend. It rested on the world's inability to stop borrowing. The shell game wasn't a trick, it was a system. And the only way to stay in the game was to never stop playing. In the final year of World War II, while cities burned and soldiers bled across continents, a different kind of battlefield emerged, one made of ledgers, treaties, and unspoken power. At the secluded Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered under the pretense of designing post-war stability. But the real architecture had already been drawn. Led by U.S. Treasury official Harry Dexter White, the plan was breathtaking in its ambition. The dollar would become the center of the global monetary system, pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, while all other currencies would peg themselves to the dollar. At first glance, it seemed a fair compromise. International discipline enforced through fixed exchange rates with gold providing the ballast. But buried within the structure was a mathematical trap. For other nations to acquire dollars to back their currencies and conduct trade, the United States would have to run persistent balance of payments deficits. In other words, global stability required American overspending. The more the U.S. consumed, the more dollars flowed outward. The more dollars circulated, the more the world relied on them. What looked like a system of mutual benefit was, in truth, a design for structural dependence. To sustain global liquidity, America had to become the world's debtor, not in the sense of weakness but of dominance. Foreign central banks accumulated dollar reserves not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Those dollars were needed to finance trade, stabilize currencies, and access the booming American economy. And while other countries had to defend their currency pegs with painful austerity or gold outflows, the U.S. could simply print. This wasn't a flaw, it was the feature. Beneath the polished speeches and multilateral jargon, the world had entered a system where one nation's deficit became everyone else's foundation. The World Bank and IMF, created at the same conference, reinforced this asymmetry. They didn't just offer funding, they offered it conditionally in ways that promoted dollar usage, dollar-denominated contracts, and dollar-based reforms. Nations in crisis didn't get sovereign solutions, they got American rules. And because the dollar was tied to gold only for foreign central banks, not private citizens, it created the illusion of convertibility while insulating domestic monetary policy. America could inflate its way out of debt while other countries had to hold dollars to survive. The dollar wasn't just money, it became leverage, a silent directive embedded into every trade, loan, and balance sheet. By the time the war ended, the physical damage to Europe and Asia ensured that no alternative could challenge it. The dollar's dominance wasn't imposed by force. It was invited in until nations realized the door had no handle on the inside. What Bretton Woods created wasn't a monetary agreement. It was a dependency loop disguised as cooperation. And every year it operated, the world sank deeper into a system it couldn't leave without bringing the whole thing down. By the late 1960s, the elegant structure crafted at Bretton Woods began to unravel, not because the agreements failed, but because they had worked too well. America had done exactly what the system required: run deficits, flood the world with dollars, and act as the engine of global liquidity. But the promise that backed it all, that dollars could be redeemed for gold at $35 per ounce, was crumbling under the weight of arithmetic. Foreign central banks, led by France under Charles de Gaulle, began calling the bluff. As U.S. deficits ballooned from war spending in Vietnam and Great Society programs at home, the gold reserves at Fort Knox dwindled. France repatriated thousands of tons, sending warships to collect what it saw as its rightful metal. Other nations quietly followed. The math had become inescapable. By 1971, foreign claims on U.S. gold exceeded the gold itself. It was a run on the system, and the vault was nearly empty. On August 15th, President Nixon faced a simple choice: lose the gold or lose control. He chose neither. In a surprise Sunday night address, he announced the suspension of dollar convertibility into gold, framing it as a temporary measure to combat speculators. But everyone knew the truth. The gold standard was dead. With one stroke, the last restraint on American monetary power vanished. The dollar became a fiat currency, backed by nothing but the promise of future payment, and so did every other major currency tethered to it. The world had entered a new phase of finance, one in which debt was no longer balanced against tangible reserves, but against belief, inertia, and fear of alternatives. What looked like a crisis was, in fact, liberation for Washington. No longer bound by the limits of gold holdings, the U.S. could now expand its debt indefinitely without triggering automatic redemption. It could print, borrow, and spend without losing credibility, because the system required those very dollars to function. The weapon of debt was now unchained, and while allies protested the betrayal of Bretton Woods, their economies remained locked in place, their reserves still denominated in dollars, their global trade still priced in them. The world had traded one kind of dependency for another, less visible but far more expansive. America's deficits, once seen as a liability, were now the lubricant of global finance. Every treasury bond issued became not just an obligation but a form of control. The gold standard had enforced discipline. Its collapse opened the door to empire by inflation. And the world, lacking any anchor of its own, had no choice but to follow the dollar deeper into the uncharted waters of fiat expansion. A promise backed by gold had become a system backed by debt, and America, once constrained by metal, now floated freely on a tide of obligation it alone could create. After cutting gold loose in 1971, America faced a terrifying question. What would compel the world to keep using a dollar backed by nothing? The answer came not through ideology or economics, but oil. In the mid-1970s, as inflation soared and confidence wavered, Washington quietly negotiated one of the most consequential financial deals in history. Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil exporter, agreed to sell its oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. In return, the U.S. provided military protection, arms, and quiet guarantees of regime security. This single decision rewired the arteries of global finance. Oil, the lifeblood of every industrial economy, could now only be purchased with dollars, which meant that any nation, whether buying fuel for its factories, fleets, or food systems, first needed to acquire U.S. currency. Demand was no longer optional, it was embedded in the energy supply chain itself. This was the birth of the petrodollar system, a self-reinforcing loop where global energy dependence translated into global dollar demand, which in turn justified American debt expansion. For every barrel of oil pumped from the ground, there was a financial echo, increased demand for U.S. Treasury securities, as oil exporting nations recycled their dollar surpluses back into American debt markets. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and others parked billions in U.S. bonds, effectively financing U.S. deficits in exchange for continued global dominance in oil. The geopolitical implications were staggering. The dollar, once just a national currency, had become the key to global energy security. Countries that challenged the system, like Iraq under Saddam or Libya under Gaddafi, faced not just sanctions, but existential threats. Meanwhile, America could run twin deficits, fiscal and trade, on a scale no other nation could imagine. Imports flowed in, capital outflows surged, but the dollar remained dominant. Because without dollars, you couldn't keep the lights on. Debt, once seen as a warning sign, now looked like infrastructure. The U.S. borrowed, the world bought, and everyone stayed afloat. The petrodollar became more than a currency mechanism, it became a hidden empire, one enforced not through conquest but through economic necessity. Every nation became a participant, a holder of American liabilities, and thus a stakeholder in the continuation of the system. And because oil was priced in dollars, every rise in oil prices created more dollar demand, strengthening the very currency most responsible for inflationary shocks. It was a paradox the U.S. could exploit endlessly. The more the system inflated, the more indispensable the dollar became. And beneath it all was a silent truth. American debt wasn't an economic failure. It was the architecture of global energy and finance. Not a bug, but the feature. The dollar no longer needed gold, and it certainly didn't need discipline. It had oil, and through oil it had everything. As the petrodollar system locked the world into dollar dependency, the mechanisms of enforcement evolved far beyond military alliances or trade deals. The true guardians of this new order wore suits, not uniforms, and operated out of Washington offices instead of embassies. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, created at Bretton Woods to stabilize the global economy, became tools of economic discipline, dispensing loans not as relief but as leverage. When developing nations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia turned to these institutions for help during financial crises, The assistance arrived with conditions that reshaped their societies. The prescriptions were always the same: cut public spending, open markets to foreign capital, float the currency, remove subsidies, and privatize state industries. These weren't technical adjustments. They were political transformations masquerading as fiscal prudence. Sovereign governments found themselves surrendering core policy decisions to unelected technocrats in Washington. Ministries once tasked with serving citizens became administrators of compliance, implementing reforms designed not for local stability, but for international investor confidence. The IMF called it conditionality, but in practice, it meant trading democratic choice for dollar liquidity. And because the world's reserves were overwhelmingly in dollars, there was no alternative. The World Bank played a parallel role, funding infrastructure that served global supply chains more than national self-sufficiency. Highways, ports, and energy grids were constructed not to integrate villages into national economies, but to connect resource basins to export terminals. The returns didn't stay in country, they flowed outward while the debt remained. In the name of development, entire economies were retrofitted to suit the priorities of foreign creditors. Countries that resisted found credit withheld, currencies attacked, or capital flight induced. The message was clear: obedience wasn't optional, it was the cost of participation. And unlike colonialism, this system didn't require boots on the ground. It worked through balance sheets, legal contracts, and the quiet threat of exclusion from global markets. In the 1980s, the Latin American debt crisis exposed the scale of this dependence. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, they all buckled under dollar-denominated debt and turned to the IMF. What followed was a crutched generation of austerity, declining public services, wage suppression, and social unrest. But their pain ensured Wall Street was repaid. In Africa, debt forgiveness campaigns revealed the grotesque paradox. Many nations had already paid more than they borrowed, yet still owed billions because of compounding interest and refinancing traps. Debt had ceased to be a means of development, it had become a permanent tether. The Global South didn't just borrow money, it borrowed subordination. In return, it received financial survival, but not sovereignty. And through it all, the dollar reigned supreme, not just as a medium of exchange, but as the final word on policy. Where empires once sent governors, America sent spreadsheets. The result was the same. In 2008, the financial system collapsed under the weight of its own delusions. Trillions in toxic mortgage-backed securities, derivatives, and shadow banking obligations imploded almost overnight, vaporizing trust across global markets. The epicenter was Wall Street, but the shockwaves paralyzed banks from London to Seoul. Entire economies teetered, unemployment soared, growth evaporated. It was the clearest indictment of the American-led financial system since its creation. Yet something extraordinary happened. Instead of being punished, America was rewarded. The world, terrified of systemic collapse, flooded into U.S. treasuries. The dollar, rather than declining, surged. The Federal Reserve, whose regulatory failure had enabled the crisis, was granted unprecedented power. It didn't just bail out domestic institutions, it extended dollar swap lines to foreign central banks, becoming the emergency lender to the planet. Iceland, South Korea, Switzerland, Brazil, all suddenly depended on Federal Reserve liquidity. The collapse revealed a brutal truth. No matter where the crisis started, the solution required more U.S. debt. And so, while other countries were forced into painful austerity, America issued trillions in stimulus, rescued its megabanks, and watched capital flood inward. The same institutions that had created the crisis, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, Citigroup, emerged stronger, larger, and more indispensable than before. Too big to fail became policy, not warning. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet exploded from under $1 trillion to over $4 trillion, monetizing debt at a scale never seen in peacetime. Quantitative easing blurred the line between central banking and fiscal intervention. Bond markets were no longer governed by risk, but by Fed intent. Global investors understood this and adjusted accordingly. The U.S., alone among nations, could inflate without fear of capital flight. Its deficits weren't just tolerated, they were demanded, because in a world where every major institution held dollar-denominated assets, the collapse of U.S. credit markets would have triggered financial extinction. Foreign governments and sovereign wealth funds quietly increased their purchases of treasuries, not because they trusted America's discipline, but because they feared the alternative. China, Japan, Germany, they all held American debt not as an investment, but as insurance. And this insurance premium grew as risk rose. The crisis didn't diminish America's financial dominance, it concentrated it. The IMF played a familiar role in the aftermath, issuing structural adjustment loans to shattered European economies like Greece and Portugal. But unlike past crises, these nations weren't victim to their own mismanagement. They were collateral damage from Wall Street's recklessness. Still, they paid the price. Austerity ravaged public services, pensions, and wages, while U.S. banks received bonuses and bailouts. Through every protest and collapsed government, the dollar remained untouched. In fact, it grew stronger. America had discovered a grim financial alchemy. The more it failed, the more the world needed it. The 2008 collapse wasn't the end of dollar supremacy, it was its expansion. Debt wasn't just a weapon, it was now a lifeline the world could neither reject nor replace. In the shadow of past crises, a quieter transformation has begun. One not of bombs or bailouts, but of code. Central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, are being presented as the next step in financial evolution. Faster payments, better transparency, streamlined efficiency. But beneath the sleek language of innovation lies something far more profound and far more dangerous. The very architecture of money is being rewritten, not just to record value, but to control it. Unlike traditional cash or even today's digital deposits, CBDCs are programmable. This means that conditions can be embedded into the currency itself: when, where, and how it can be spent. Transactions can be approved or denied based on user identity, location, political alignment, or social behavior. And in the United States, where the dollar is not just a national currency but the bedrock of global finance, the implications are staggering. For the first time in history, monetary policy and behavioral governance could converge into a single instrument. Imagine stimulus payments that expire if not spent within 30 days. Imagine benefits that cannot be used for air travel, alcohol, or politically disfavored causes. Imagine a monetary system that doesn't just observe your financial behavior, it shapes it. This is not hypothetical. Pilot programs are already underway. China's digital yuan has already introduced expiration-based stimulus. The U.S. is studying CBDC frameworks through the Federal Reserve and Treasury, with partnerships quietly forming among banks, fintechs, and surveillance firms. Under the banner of modernity, a new layer of control is being coded into the global economy. And because the dollar is the reserve currency, any digitization of it becomes a global standard by default. Foreign governments that rely on dollar liquidity may find themselves required to adopt infrastructure that aligns with American policy objectives. Sanctions won't just block access to banks, they'll block access to money itself. And unlike traditional sanctions, which require institutional enforcement, digital dollars can be shut off instantly, algorithmically, without due process. This isn't just a change in payment systems, it's the transformation of money from neutral medium to conditional asset. For the American debt empire, this is the perfect evolution. In a world of digital currency, debt repayment can be hard-coded. Behavior can be incentivized or punished in real time. Tax collection becomes automated, capital controls become seamless, compliance becomes non-negotiable. For the individual, this means the end of true financial autonomy. For nations, it means that accepting dollar support may now require accepting dollar surveillance. As CBDCs roll out, the battle for monetary freedom won't be fought in parliaments or on trading floors, but in the lines of code that define who gets to spend and who gets locked out. Debt, once issued in paper, then in spreadsheets, is now being etched directly into software. The dollar's greatest weapon is no longer just economic, it is becoming existential. Across a century of transformation, the United States perfected a new kind of empire, one that didn't require colonies or conquests, only contracts. It didn't need to extract gold, it needed others to hold dollars. It didn't have to dominate through force, it dominated through finance. As industries moved offshore and wars dragged on without victory, America's true power consolidated not in its factories or its armies, but in the invisible architecture of debt. The world owes America trillions, not just in loans, but in system dependency. Global reserves are denominated in dollars, trade priced in dollars, credit benchmarks set by U.S. interest rates. From Riyadh to Rio, from Frankfurt to Jakarta, central banks align their survival with the health of U.S. Treasury markets. Every financial crisis proves the same thing. No matter where the earthquake begins, the world rushes back to the dollar as refuge. But beneath this dominance lies a tension the system cannot escape forever. The power to issue infinite debt is only sustainable if belief holds. Belief in repayment, in American stability, in the idea that the center will hold. Yet that center grows more fragile by the year. U.S. debt now exceeds $35 trillion and climbs by the second. Interest payments alone consume more than the military budget. Political paralysis prevents structural reform. Entitlement obligations loom like a fiscal time bomb. And the very nations who prop up the system, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, have begun quietly shifting, diversifying, hedging against the unthinkable. They see what America's own citizens are starting to realize, that the empire runs not on production, but on promises. And promises can be broken. The rise of alternative systems, BRICS reserve currencies, Chinese-led trade agreements, crypto networks outside dollar reach, signals that the monopoly is not eternal. If confidence falters, if inflation eats trust faster than the Fed can print relief, if a geopolitical rupture severs supply chains or accelerates de-dollarization, the entire scaffolding could shudder. For now, the dollar still reigns. But it does so on borrowed time and borrowed money. The same mechanism that secured global dominance, debt, has become the fragility no one dares confront. And so the empire stretches further, borrowing to patch yesterday's deficits, spending to stave off tomorrow's decline. Every new loan is both a lifeline and a countdown. Final convergence approaches, the moment when issuing more debt no longer strengthens the system but reveals its insolvency. When creditors stop pretending and allies stop obeying. The dollar empire wasn't built by conquest, it was built by addiction. And like all addictions, it ends when the high fades and the costs can no longer be deferred. America taught the world to believe in debt, but belief, like credit, has a limit. And when it runs out, history doesn't forgive. It resets.